Good morning, everyone. First of all, let us wish you all a very happy Independence Day. We are in the 75th year of independence, so it's none other than a very beautiful day for us. If we remember the 1947 or before that, so we can assume that we are independent now. We are in freedom. We are having every kind of freedom today. So happy Independence Day to all the viewers, to everyone. So. Good morning, Anil Bhandari sir. Good morning, MPV sir. Manish Saxena sir, we have today with us. He has wide or rich experience in valuation, and we have the topic today, valuation of complex securities. Last time we had already minority shareholding valuation as well as equity valuation. So to start with, as we all know that complex securities encompass a wide range of securities and instruments actually. Equity, hybrid instruments are attached to it. So they have a different technique which may be called as also a complex technique of valuation. So starting from range of techniques to the methodology of securities valuation, we will cover today. And we all know that these techniques may also have Black-Scholes method, latest models such as binomial, Monte Carlo simulations, and also the purpose of the securities may be different than the complex equity valuation or business valuation. Sir will cover everything like ASC, taxation purposes, IFRS 2, wherever this valuation of complex securities is required. Over to you, sir. I will hand over now to Anil Bhandari, sir, to take over.
Thank you, Sarika. A very warm welcome to all our viewers once again, and a very happy Independence Day. Absolutely a fantastic time during the year when we celebrate our independence. And as valuation experts, I guess we have to maintain high quality of independence as well. So it's a wonderful day today. I have MPV smiling at me. MPV, we understand you are at the airport, but I think we have a very interesting speaker, I must say, in Manish Saxena. I could understand something to do with brand, equity valuation. Now we have something as complex instrument valuation. So the word complex, instruments, and valuation, all three are complex for me. Without taking too much time on this day, I would put forward this back to our friend MPV and my co-chair of the Valuation Standards Board to start having this wonderful conversation with Manish. So on to you, MPV.
Yeah, thanks, Anil, and Independence Day greetings to all. Thank you, Manish, for accepting our invite to be present here. And as Chairman Anil was mentioning, all the three terms are quite complex by themselves. One is itself referred as complex, other is instruments, and we know the wide variety of instruments which people are structuring. And valuation, we all know there is an element of subjectivity, while we all try to do it as objective as possible. So just to start off the discussion today, given the fact that we have a very wide number of members here with who are young and with less experience to very experienced members, we can start with a quick introduction of, for the purpose of our discussion today, what constitute complex securities. For example, now I come across almost every organization having some special purpose vehicles, and with the private equity funds and other infrastructure funds being so very active in participation, they all fund it with so many kinds of instruments. People want to call it as equity, but they have preferential liquidation rights. So many combinations are there, So right. Can you help us to begin with, to set the boundary for today's discussion as to what constitutes this complex securities, considering the fact that it's not a defined term?
Right, right. Thanks, MPV and Anil. It's a pleasure to be on this event today, and a very happy Independence Day to all the participants of this session. Yeah, sure. So I think I'll start with that context so that everybody knows what we are discussing today. I'll try to define what a complex security is. And as MPV rightly mentioned, if you look at any standards, whether it is IFRS, Ind AS, or even IBSC, none of these standards define the term complex securities. I mean, what they define is what is known as financial instruments. So if you look at IBSC or Ind AS 109, all these standards define what is a financial instrument. And the definition of a financial instrument as defined in the accounting standard and IBSC is that it is a contract between two parties which creates a financial asset for one party and a financial liability or equity instrument for the other party. So for example, if you look at a common share, it is a financial instrument because from the investor's perspective, it is an asset, right? It is an asset which he has invested in. And from the company issuer's perspective, it is an equity instrument which has been issued, right? If you look at a debt instrument, again, it is an asset from the perspective of the investor. It is a liability from the perspective of the issuer. So any contract which meets this criteria is defined as a financial instrument. It has to create a financial asset. The keyword is financial asset for the holder and the financial liability or an equity for the issuer. So that's what a financial instrument is, right? Now, if you look at this definition, there are broadly 4 categories of financial instruments that can exist. One category is a pure equity instrument, which is your common share, your preference shares, or compulsorily convertible shares with a fixed ratio. So these are types of pure equity shares. Then you have pure debt instruments, which is like a bond, debentures. That is the second category of financial instrument, which meets this criteria. Third category is your derivatives, pure derivative instruments, like options, currency options, commodity options, forward contracts. These pure derivatives are the third category of financial instruments. And then there is a fourth category, which is known as the compound or the hybrid instruments. So that fourth category is nothing but a mix. When one or more of these first 3 category of instrument combine, they create a hybrid or a compound instrument, right?
So Manish, sorry, but I kind of slipped up the first 1 and 2 just for, I'm sorry for the repetition, but yeah.
Right.
The first one you said was?
Pure equity instrument. So common pure share equity, is the best example, which is giving you a ownership of a company, a particular ownership. Right? Second is a pure debt instrument. So let's say a bond issued by a company is a pure debt instrument, right? Third is a pure derivative. So let's say if I take a example of let's say currency option, which a company uses to hedge, it's a pure derivative instrument, right?
Right.
The fourth category is a combination, which is known as the hybrid or the compound instrument. So when either a equity or debt combine, or a debt equity plus a derivative, when they combine, it creates a hybrid or a compound instrument.
And what happens to a debt which is, say, for example, 100 years? Is there a terminology for that, or it just falls into a debt instrument?
So debt can be, again, there can be various variants of debt. There could be a perpetual bond, there could be a non-interest paying bond, there could be a bullet payment bond. So these are variants. Essentially, all these are pure debt instruments, right? And the fourth category is where you have features of a derivative or a debt, where equity or a liability. So when these two combine, pure instruments combine, they give rise to a compound instrument.
Fantastic.
So essentially, when we are talking about complex securities, we are talking about the third and fourth category. So essentially, it is the derivative and the compound instrument. So compound also will always have a feature of embedded derivative or a combination of a. So that's the meaning of a complex security.
And you're saying that these are to be valued as well, is it?
Yes. So I think most of the colleagues on the call today would have experienced valuation of a pure equity instrument, right? Like a company share or a debt, also in some cases. But this third and fourth category is not very common, and it's slightly complex. So that is why it is known as a complex security. And there's a lot of requirement for the valuation, which we'll talk about later for this complex.
Wow. So I was so engaged with our valuation topics every Sunday MPV. I started to watch Ashwath Damodaran on the YouTube, trying to understand fundamentals of valuation.
Right.
And he was talking about businesses, and Manish is talking about the complexity that probably I would have never looked at. So this is an exciting discussion that we're getting onto. Yeah, Janani, comment. Back to you, MPV. Yeah.
So Manish, actually, one small edit with my experience I'd like to share is that. So while the 4 classifications is so nicely explained and brought out, if you look at a good number of transactions which are currently happening, they seem to be happening on the 4th category and the 3rd category. While simple equity, simple debt instruments are there in the context of some established companies and things like that. But if you look at the startups, the private equities, the fundings, infrastructure projects, all of that, almost all of them come with instruments where it's so difficult to identify whether it's a debt or an equity or a combination. So I'd just like to highlight to the benefit of members that many of them on the face of it might appear to be an equity or a debt, but may actually have a combination of both, because there would be some rights and obligations which are sitting in that 20-page agreement, which actually will make all of the difference. And I'm seeing those type of instruments on the rise. I'd just like to caution the members on that. Now, Manish, is it fair to say, for the purpose of our discussion, that anything other than a vanilla equity or a debt can be treated as a complex security? Can we keep it in simple terms, given the fact that it is not a defined term in any literature?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this term is not defined. It is just that a lot of practitioners or the firms, they try to, because this requires a unique skill set, right, to value. So they try to create teams which are specialist teams, and they call these teams in their firm as complex security valuation team. That's the only relevance of the term, but it's not defined in any standard.
Yeah. Exactly. So, Manish, can you articulate for the benefit of participants?
Right.
Why do companies encourage or engage in these kind of securities? What is actually driving them to look at these kind of securities? And second is from the investor's perspective. Why do they prefer this kind of structuring?
Right. Yeah, that's a very fair question, because everybody would be wondering that why do we need so many types of securities? What purpose these securities serve? So if you look at it, I'll come to the investor perspective, but if you look at it from the company's perspective, because that's what we deal with as a chartered accountant or as a professional. So if you look at it from a company's perspective, essentially there are 2 types of transactions which create these financial instruments, right? So the first type of transaction is for fundraising. So whenever a company requires funds, it has to raise funds through one of these instruments. So either company can choose to raise fund through equity, or it can raise funds through debt by issuing bonds, or as MPV rightly mentioned, nowadays most of the startups, if you see, they raise funds through a complex instrument, the convertible instruments, of which has a lot of these downside protections. So that's I'll come to how a company selects one of these, but that's the first category of transaction, raising fund that creates the instrument. The second category of transaction because of which the instruments are created is the risk management requirement. So any company which is exposed to different types of risks, like commodity risk or interest rate risk, currency risk, the company tries to manage these risks. And the way it does is through derivative instruments. For example, an IT company exposed to currency risk, the future revenue receivable is exposed to currency fluctuation, right? So the company may enter into currency options or forward contracts to manage that risk. Or a company exposed to has a variable interest rate, they want to fix that rate, so they may get into a swap, interest rate swap. So these type of second transactions, which are for risk management, create these derivatives on the balance sheet of a company, right? Now, coming to within the first category, which is for fundraising, how does a company select whether I want to issue equity, debt, or a hybrid, right? So there it is. There are various factors which go into deciding what instrument which will the company select eventually. But primarily, the choice of an instrument depends on the risk-reward trade-off, right? So for example, if you look at a startup, can a startup raise debt fund through debt? The answer is no, because if you look at it from an investor perspective, investor will never invest in a startup through debt because the risk is too high. The return that the investor will get from a debt will be small to not commensurate with the risk which the investor is taking, right? So startup will most likely raise fund through equity. So the choice of instrument for a startup is equity. And then the negotiations, even the equity risk is too high. So the investors tries to negotiate, these downside protection clauses in the agreement, like the liquidation preference, optionally the put option also is given to the investor sometimes. So that creates the hybrid instrument in case of startup. For a more mature company and an asset-heavy company, debt is also an option. Ideally, a promoter will want to raise capital through debt because it does not lead to dilution, right? But you need to have that risk profile to be able to attract debt investor for the company. So those are various reasons, because of which different instruments get created.
So, thanks, Manish. I think you very nicely articulated.
Right.
Can you take this discussion one step forward based on your experience of engaging with various clients and the investors?
Right.
A few examples of these hybrid instruments or compound instruments.
Right.
And at this stage, Anil, I'll just give you one example I came across 2 weeks back. There was one entity who was actually issuing compulsorily convertible debentures, convertible after 8-9 years, whatever period. So it means in India, it's what we call as fixed for fixed. Fixed amount for a fixed number of shares, it qualifies as equity. So even though it's called a compulsory debenture, it's called as equity. But there what happened is the parent company had agreed to buy back those debentures in the 5th or 6th year.
Okay.
So for the purpose of consolidated financial statements, it becomes a liability. So, so in the consolidated it becomes a liability, and they ended up with breaching some of their bankers' covenants. So you think it's an equity and you engage at one level, but there is some other contract you have signed in another entity. So you actually end up with being a debt at a parent level when you do the consolidation. So it's so very complex, and it misleads you to come to a quick conclusion that there's equity.
So what you're trying to explain for my benefit is at a standalone level, this looked like an equity.
It is an equity.
At a console level, because they had the option, or they would buy after 5 or 7 years.
They would buy. They would buy.
They would buy. So there was no option there.
Exactly.
No, they would buy after 7 years. Then even in the standalone balance sheet, it should ideally not have been an equity, right?
No. For standalone, it's a separate legal entity. For that entity, there is no legal obligation to pay.
No. Got it.
It is the parent who has to pay it back.
It's like a quasi equity form. Yeah, got it. Okay, but the parent is still a debt. Interesting. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. So if you value the step down, you do a kind of an equity valuation.
Exactly.
Right, but for them, it that falls into the debt. Okay, interesting. So, Manish, just like MPV kind of gave an example, and I mean, for my mind, it's slightly complex. So, maybe if you could refer to one balance sheet in India, because it's all public domain for listed, and say, okay, this is an instrument, for example, this company did, which is a complex instrument or whatever. Maybe 1 or 2 examples that we can, just for clarity's sake.
Sure, Anil. So I think a listed company may not be a good example because a listed company is already a mature company, right? So you'll find mainly common shares in a company or debt, so very rare to find these complex compound instruments in a listed company. As per my experience, these instruments have become like a norm in most of these startups, and every day we are seeing a unicorn being created in India, right? So if you look at any big startup or a large, let's say, unicorn, the investors, when they're investing in these companies, are doing it through CCPS, what is known as a compulsorily convertible preference shares. Right now, as MPV was explaining, if a CCPS from a very high level may look like a equity instrument if the conversion ratio is fixed. So let's say if I invest in a company with through a CCPS where the conversion is fixed at 1:1. So my CCPS will convert into one common share always, let's say after 5 years, right? So that's a pure equity instrument. It's as good as a common share. You know, the only difference being that I may lose out on dividend till the time I convert, but for practical purpose, it is like a common share.
Got it.
But what is happening is, if you look closely to the terms and if you read the...
But why would somebody do a CCP which is standard, right? They would align it to some benchmark and say that it would be variable, right? I mean, that's where the complexity comes.
There could be
he's coming there. He's coming.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, so even a pure vanilla CCPS without any downside protection may exist, and that could be because of the tax aspects. You know, there are certain tax reasons why a certain common share may not be, or to take benefit of certain regulatory aspects. You know, the investor may invest to a CCPS which is as good as equity, just the form is different because of some tax considerations or a regulatory consideration, right? But purely from a commercial perspective, if you look closely, there are clauses which makes these CCPS more like a hybrid instrument, not pure equity, right? So one common clause which MPV was also referring to is conversion clause. So if it is a pure fixed conversion, it is equity. But I have seen in my personal experience very complex conversion clauses, you know, which say that if the IPO happens, the conversion will be like this. If the company gets acquired at this valuation, there'll be a different conversion, right? So when you have these complex conversion clauses, it makes the instrument as a hybrid instrument because it does not meet that criteria of fixed for fixed conversion, right? Because here because of the variability in conversion, the investor is getting a downside protection because he may convert in such a manner that his stake increases, right? So he's in a way protected from the downside. So that brings an element of debt liability in the picture. And that is one most common type of instrument I've seen, CCPS with a variable conversion clause, right? The second type of instrument I've seen is with a buyback or a put option embedded in the instrument CCPS. So like a lot of startups...
I'd just like to hold you there for a minute only before you go to the... So the first one which you said, conversion with some complexity built in.
Right.
Now, if you were to value that startup or that company which has acquired this set of instrument, maybe for the second round or the third round, how does this valuation move? Just at an 80,000 feet?
Yeah, so we are doing a lot of these valuations, and that requirement for valuation is primarily emanating from the Ind AS standard 109, right? So whenever you have these clauses, conversion clauses, which are variable in nature, the instrument becomes like a liability, or there could be entire instrument may be classified as a derivative liability, right? Which requires a regular valuation. If it was an equity, you don't even need a valuation, right? Subsequently. So it will just remain at the same value at which it was initially invested. But if because of these clauses, it gets classified as a derivative liability. And when we do the valuation again, I'll come to the method later, but just to give flavor, there are two steps involved. First is you have to value the company, which almost I think everybody knows how to value a company, right? And then second method is we use a simulation technique or the option pricing technique. So starting with the company value first, we use that as an input to the simulation technique, and we run multiple simulations of the future outcome of the company value. And then we see how the different conversion sort of ratios play out.
Take place, okay.
And we calculate the payoff from the instrument in different scenarios, and then apply probability to each of these scenarios, and then discount it to present value. That's a very high level way of valuing these.
So assuming, I'll just hold you there because that's a very simplistic way to explain. So,
Right.
but I'm also still trying to clear my head in terms of when I look at the company standalone, and this company has acquired this convertible at a certain target for a certain event or whatever. When I'm valuing this company, where does this liability portion come in? Because it is likely to convert into equity, either more or less. So where does this kick in?
Yeah, so that is where, see, the first step when I mentioned, I refer to the enterprise value without allocating that enterprise value to the shareholders. Now, let's say the enterprise value starting is 100 crores. I'm not even looking at the allocation of that 100 crores. Today, we counted the asset value of the company is 100 crores. Now, I will create multiple scenarios that 100 can become 200 in the future. It can become 50 in the future, right? Now, under each of these scenarios, the allocation of the company value will differ. If it was a pure equity, I don't have to do that because in all the scenarios, everybody will get the same stake. You know, if I'm holding 10%, I will get 10%, irrespective of the value of the company, right? But when you have these different conversion clauses in different scenarios of valuation, the allocation will differ. It will not be constant proportion of the shareholding, right? And in those different scenarios, you allocate that enterprise value in the manner laid out in the investment agreement as per the conversion terms. And then you create the payoffs and then you discount it to present value. That's how we value, right?
Got it. Fantastic.
Yeah. So Anil, actually, just to continue from where you said, and to bring to notice, particularly of the young valuers who are just getting into the field, I think the important point to highlight or share as an experience is almost all cases of structured funding or the startup funding, SPV funding, infrastructure funding, they all come with instruments which are convertible and with lots of tags attached. And like you mentioned, as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, you would like to maximize your value by linking the conversion to your earnings potential. Correct. So the moment you do that kind of a linking, it automatically becomes a liability. It automatically becomes a liability because as an entity, whatever amount I'm raising now, instead of settling in cash, I'm going to settle in shares at that point in time. So it's not treated as issuance of shares today. It is treated as borrowed money, but settled in the form of
equity.
Shares
exactly. In the form of shares.
Exactly. So I thought I'll use this opportunity because it's a very common criticism which everybody says that, and particularly I've come across a few entrepreneurs who are who come across a lot of anger.
But I'm only trying to look at it from an overall valuation perspective. Now, for example, once I've done this transaction and I've acquired these instruments, now if I go for the second round of valuation of my company, say for example, if I've acquired and we have put in this clauses that after 3 years, if the company does XYZ is good. But in the next 1 year, you go back to the market, right? With this kind of amount sitting there. How would it benefit to take that portion as debt because there is no cash outflow around the debt, right? There is no interest element, etc., etc. It's just likely to change the shareholding pattern between two shareholders now, right? So the enterprise value is not changing of the organization even in the second round of values. Am I right?
Correct.
Fundamentally, it's not. It's changing the proportion. I may hold 50%. I may end up holding only 20% because you have not done well, or I may end up holding 70% because you have done well. Correct. But in a lender's, let me not say lender, but in an investor's books, does that valuation change? Is the question mark? Because for that period of time, some amount goes in and some amount is still a debt. Does that make a difference, Manish?
No, so the accounting is slightly different from an investor perspective versus the company which has issued that instrument's perspective. So investor will record it as a single asset. It will not, because it does not matter for investor whether it's equity or debt. It is an asset for him, right? It is like a downside protection embedded in the asset, but it's still one asset. This bifurcation or accounting requirement is from a company's perspective, where they either have to break that instrument into equity or debt, or recognize the entire instrument itself as a liability. And sometimes, you're right that it looks like why is this liability being created? But that's how the accounting standards have been drafted, where it gives the flexibility to the company to either break that into components. You bifurcate what is the liability component and record it separately as and just mark to market only that component, or you value the entire instrument as in totality. It also depends on what is more convenient and whether it is even possible to break it. Sometimes the embedded derivative is so closely embedded that it's difficult to identify or segregate that embedded derivative, right? So in which case it becomes easier to value the entire instrument itself, which is
Fantastic.
in this case of a very
I always blame MPB for all the complexities in the accounting and accounting standards. Yeah. Okay,
And
back to you, MPB.
between us, we have a gentleman agreement that whatever is simple, we give the credit to Anil. Okay. So Manish, coming back, I think you have so beautifully laid down the canvas. Now, can we spend the next few minutes where you can articulate for the participants' benefit? How does one go about valuing these complex securities? As you mentioned, up to the enterprise value, it's common, but thereafter it is allocation amongst various. So how do we do that? So maybe you can explain to us in simple terms. You can take a little bit of time too.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we are getting into a topic where I can take 4 hours and, it will be not enough because it's a complete subject in itself. But
Manish, it is easy to explain in 4 hours. We are making it difficult for you to explain in 4 minutes here.
Right.
We are making it complex for you.
Complex for you to.
Yeah, right. So as I'll attempt to explain in a very layman's term for the benefit of people. So as I was referring to earlier, there are 4 types of instruments, financial instruments, right? And most of us are conversant with the valuation of pure equity or pure debt instruments. So let's look at first of all the principles behind equity and debt instrument valuation, and then how the complex instrument methodology differs. We'll come to that so that it's easier to understand the context. So if you look at pure equity instrument, we all know that we use an income approach to value an equity instrument, right? Common share, where we forecast the cash flows and then we discount it with a cost of capital and we get the value of the company, right? And equity, it is let's say if I want to calculate per share value, I'll divide it with the number of shares. So I'll get the per share value of a common share. That's how we value common share, common equity. If you look at a debt instrument, a bond, I will again use an income approach where I will forecast the principal and the interest payment in the future based on the terms of the bond. And instead of cost of equity, I'll use a cost of debt representing the credit risk, and I'll discount it to the present value. So again, the approach is very simple. It's an income approach even for a debt instrument, right? So whether I'm valuing a pure vanilla equity instrument or pure vanilla debt instrument, I'm using an income approach where essentially I'm forecasting one likely scenario of the cash flow in the future, right? And discounting it with the cost of debt. Now here, essentially, if you see whether it's equity or debt, it's not like we are 100% sure that scenario is going to play out, which we are forecasting, right? There are always cases where there will be a variability in the cash flows in the future or uncertainty around the cash flows, but we still try to factor that uncertainty or the risk in the cash flows in the discount rate itself, right? So we try to take a higher discount rate. If we feel the scenario that we are forecasting is uncertain, we may add an alpha in the discount rate, right? And that is how we factor the risk in the cash flows. So that's the broad approach for valuing a common share or a debt instrument. Now, what
do you also get? So, since you're at the discount, do you also get the betas for all of these debt instruments and all that? I'm sure you would get that in the public domain, and you are then able to use that to kind of settle your discount rates. Is it?
So debt instrument, you don't need a beta. See, beta is measures your systemic risk of an equity investment, right? So beta is always used for a cost of equity calculation using a CAPM.
I understood the beta for the listed equities, but I'm saying there could be a similar beta for a debt which is also traded. So internationally, of course, debt is, and locally also debt is traded, right? Mm-hmm. So do you also get some element of risk like a beta in the debt instruments?
No, so when we value debt instrument, what matters in the discount rate is the credit risk of the company.
Right.
Because as a debt investor, my downside is protected, right? If something goes wrong in the company has to pay me the principal amount at least over any other payment, right? So the risk of a debt instrument is lower than an equity instrument. The only risk I am exposed as a debt instrument holder is the risk of default. So if the company is not, if the company value declines so much that company is not even able to pay my principal, that is where I am taking the risk. So the discount rate, there's always a matching principle, right? The discount rate represents the risk in the cash flows. So when I'm valuing a debt instrument, the risk in the cash flows, which is the principal and interest payment, is only the default risk. It's not the variability in the cash flows, which is what the beta measures. So I just add the risk-free rate and the credit spread, and that gives me the discount rate for a debt instrument. There's no beta involved. And the credit, there are ways to calculate the credit spread. You can look at, in India, we look at FIMDA. There's a website called agency called FIMDA, which publishes the credit spreads. So you need to first find the rating of a company. Let's say it's AAA rated, BBB, CCC. Once you know the rating of the company, you can find out the spread, right? Spread of that given rating through these agencies like FIMDA, even CRISIL. There are also bonds which are traded, like shares. Shares are traded. There are bonds which are traded in the market for a particular rating. So you can find out the implied credit spread from the yield of those bonds, right? So if I'm valuing a CCC rated private company's bond, I can look at, are there any CCC traded bonds? And then I can come up with a credit spread in that CCC traded bond and use it for my company's valuation.
Right. But so fundamentally, MPV, is that not very similar to the beta? I mean, of course, does this fundamentally...
Expression-wise, we use the term beta in context of equity valuation.
Equity only. Okay. No, I mean, fundamentally, beta means a beta, right? Beta means a variability, right?
Right.
Variability, but we use it in the context of equity valuation. So your point is taken. That
no, I'm just trying to understand in my mind that, beta is nothing but a variability. So variability comes from the spread or from the rating and from an equal distribution in the market or not. And then the bonds are traded, then you're able to identify that. Fair enough. So you use that to come to the right discounted rate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because equity, as you would agree, is highly variable, right? You have a downside risk. Even if a 10% revenue declines, you as an equity investor are exposed to that risk, right? So the risk is very high. And beta is capturing that movement, the variability.
Very quickly. Okay.
Yeah. But in a debt instrument, there's no risk like an equity instrument. The downside is protected only in extreme case when the company value goes down to that extent, then it defaults. So that risk is not measured through a beta, but through a credit spread. Credit spread. Which can also be quantified.
Fair enough. Perfect.
So that's how you value a debt instrument, right?
Okay.
Anything else on the debt instrument? Or
I think fairly well explained. Again, on the income side, and again you put those rates, and that's how you arrive at a normal debt valuation.
Right.
No, fair enough.
Yeah. So what is common in these two approaches, whether you're looking at debt or equity, is that you are essentially forecasting a likely scenario. You're only forecasting one scenario of the cash flow in the future, right? And discounting it to present value. The risk you are trying to factor either through beta or the credit risk in the discount rate itself, right? So that's how you value a plain vanilla equity and debt instrument. Now, when we come to complex securities or a derivative like an option, how the payoff differs or the instrument behavior differs is that, first of all, the payoff is non-linear. So if you look at an option payoff or a compound instrument payoff, you have a payoff where if the company does well, you have an upside, like an equity investor. But if the company does not well, your downside is zero or protected, right? Or its downside is limited. Even if it's not zero, it's limited. So there's the payoff sort of profile is very non-linear. It's not 10% up or 10% down, right? So in this case, the traditional approach of projecting one scenario doesn't work, because if I, let's say, forecast the payoff from an option, I cannot with confidence say that, I'm going to get this amount if my let's say exercise price is 900 and my future value is most likely be 150. Because if I forecast only 150 as the future stock price, 50 is just one of the scenario. I may get a zero payoff also if the value declines below zero. So it's a non-linear payoff, right? In case of an option, even a hybrid security, let's say the optionally convertible preference share, where I've invested 100 crores, and if my value of the company goes up, then I will convert and I'll behave like a equity investor. But if it goes down, then I'll behave like a debt instrument. So my downside payoff is always 100 crores, but my upside can be 500, right? So this payoff is non-linear.
So let me hold you there. There. I'm saying again, for simplicity's sake. So this was a great example. How do you value this?
Yeah. So that is where I'm just saying that the traditional approach does not work here, because you are not able to factor that risk of non-linearity in the discount rate itself. So you cannot project one scenario and discount it with a higher discount rate and say this is the value. So the valuation approach that we use is a stimulation-based approach or a scenario-based approach. The example which I gave earlier to your question also, right? Yeah. So which is also, and I'll come to the more technical aspect of what an option pricing method is, right? So whenever you are coming across an instrument or a derivative where the payoff is non-linear, where you have option-like payoff, where you have either zero or an upside, you have to use a simulation-based technique or a scenario-based technique. So instead of forecasting one scenario of a cash flow, like we do in equity valuation, what you will do is you'll calculate hundreds of possible scenarios in future. And in each scenario, you'll go out far in, let's say, 5 years. If the conversion term is 5 years or the option is getting exercised after 5 years, you calculate multiple scenarios of company value. And in each scenario, you calculate the payoff. In some scenarios, the payoff will be like equity. In some scenarios, the payoff will be zero if you are valuing an option. And then you assign probabilities to those scenarios and calculate the probability weighted payoff and discount it to present value. That gives the value of that instrument. So that's
is there a model? Is there a model behind this, Manish?
Right. So once we understand this concept of how the non-linear payoff works, now there are tools. And this is the broad concept behind each of these tools, which I'll talk about, or the methods. So there are now the most common option pricing method we know is Black-Scholes, right? Black-Scholes method. Then we have binomial or lattice model, and we have a Monte Carlo simulation technique. Now, essentially,
so fundamentally, in maybe one line, can you explain the difference between these three models?
Yeah, exactly.
Just in a simple,
Yeah, I'll come to the difference, but first look at what is common in the three models, right? So essentially, all the three models are, as an outsider, looks very different. But I don't think we have the format of this event like this. Otherwise, I could have shown that if I use each of the three tools, I can come to the exact same value of a plain vanilla option instrument using three different techniques: Black-Scholes, lattice, and Monte Carlo. Because essentially, all the three models are doing nothing but creating multiple scenarios in the future, calculating payoffs in those scenarios, assigning probability, and then doing the price. So that's the common fundamental concept behind these three approaches. Right now, I'll come to the difference. How the three models differ is, if you look at Black-Scholes, it's a formula. It's a closed-ended tool. So you start with the company value and then you put that as an input to the formula. So Black-Scholes, I will take an example. It's mainly used for ESOP valuation or a call option or a put option valuation, right? So call option is nothing but an instrument where you have the right to buy the underlying asset. So if it's a call option on an equity instrument, you have a right to buy that equity share at a future given date at a predetermined exercise price. So let's say the exercise price is 100, and I have a, let's say the option is written on Infosys share or any share which is listed. right? And the share is trading at 200 today. And the option is for a 1 year period, which means that if I have a call option, I have the right to buy that Infosys share after a 1 year period at 100 rupees, irrespective of the share price prevailing after 1 year.
Right.
So that is also similar to how the convertible, optionally convertible work. It's an embedded call option, slightly different. But if you focus on this common option, call option, so here if you look at the payoff after 1 year, you will use this Black-Scholes to value this common type of call option, where you will input 200 as your current price, 100 as your exercise price, and then you will input the volatility as one of the input, the risk-free rate as one of the input, and then the Black-Scholes model will throw you a number. Let's say it is 20 rupees. So 20 rupees is nothing but the, so if I go back to the concept which I explained, it is nothing, the way at the back end, the way the Black-Scholes model is working is that starting with the 200 value today of Infosys shares, it is projecting multiple scenarios in the future after 1 year. That 200 can become 300, it can become 50, it can become 100. Right now, in case 200 becomes 50, the payoff is 0, right? Because your exercise price is 100. You will never exercise the option because you will have to pay 100 rupees to get something which is worth 50. So the payoff will be 0 from that option. But if it is stock price is 300, the payoff will be 200 because you by paying 100, you're getting share worth 300. So essentially at the back end, Black-Scholes is doing this. It is calculating infinite scenarios of future possible share prices and calculating the payoffs in different scenarios and then giving you a number which is nothing, which is the 20 rupees. So that is nothing but the probability weighted payoff in different scenario. But it is doing through a formula. You can't see the scenarios being created at the back end of the formula. It is just giving you
but there would be something, I'm not sure, but there would be something in model A and something in model B. Right. So for example, is a black swan event factored in a Black-Scholes model or not? And is it factored in some other, I mean, is there a, I'm just saying, I'm shooting at 80,000 feet, ignore my understanding please. So I'm saying, is there a fundamental difference between these 2-3 models? Like, for example, you could say Black-Scholes considers this, but this model does not consider this, something like that.
Sure. So as we saw, Black-Scholes is a formula-driven model, though it is doing conceptually the same thing, but it is only asking for you, asking certain inputs from you, right? So you don't have the flexibility. You can only value a plain vanilla call option through Black-Scholes because you input these 5-6 inputs and it will give you a number of 20 rupees or whatever as the option value. So the challenge in the Black-Scholes is that it does not give you the flexibility. So to value a complex instrument. Now the other models are lattice model, binomial, or a Monte Carlo simulation model. Yeah. So sometimes you will deal, let's say I'm valuing an instrument or an option where the exercise price itself is not fixed. In the first example which I gave you of the Infosys option, the exercise was 100, right? Price was 100 and the share price was 200. So you could have input that in the model and you would have got the value. Now let's say I give you an option where the exercise is dependent on certain event, that my exercise price will become 200 if something happens, or it will become 100 if something else happens, right? There's an option here, there's an instrument where you have the exercise price like this. Or there are certain times we come across an instrument where the exercise price is linked to the IRR. In an optionally convertible instrument, what it says is that if you invest 100 crores, the investor will get a 10% return for sure after 5 years, which means after 5 years, 100 plus 10% accrued over 5 years, that will become the minimum price which the investor will get. And he can also participate in the upside, which means he has the right to become like an equity investor if the company value doubles. But at a minimum, he will get 100 plus 10% accrued over 5 years. So there, it is not a fixed exercise. If you see every year, the exercise price is changing, right? First year, it is 100. Second year, it is 100 plus 10%. then fifth year it is 100 plus 10% over 5 years. Or the first example where I said the exercise price could depend on IPO scenario or a, let's say, non-IPO scenario. It could be variable. Now, these type of cases you can't model in a Black-Scholes because it allows you to input only one exercise price. So that application is limited in such complex scenarios. So you have other tools available, which is your binomial or lattice model or a Monte Carlo simulation.
Got
the
it.
concept is still the same, but what these tools does is it gives you the flexibility to project finite scenarios in the future. The Black-Scholes is projecting infinite scenarios, which you cannot see. Now, using a binomial or a Monte Carlo simulation, you can decide that I want to create 100 scenarios or let's say 1 lakh scenarios in the future, and you calculate the payoff by bringing that flexibility of the exercise price being different in different scenarios.
So would it be fair to say that you use these two models where there is more certainty in your mind or generally perceived in the market for certain set of scenarios?
Yeah.
And even the complexity of the instrument is that it can give only 10 scenarios, for example.
Yes.
Then you use the binomial model and all of that.
Right.
Otherwise, you go and use the Black-Scholes model. That's what you're trying to say.
No, so I would say Black-Scholes is the closed-ended because there the flexibility of changing the input is not there. You have to give 5 inputs, so you cannot change the input like an exercise price. So when you're dealing with a plain vanilla option, like a call option on Infosys, which I first explained, the choice of method is a Black-Scholes because it's a defined input you're giving in as an input to the model.
Got it.
But when you're dealing with an instrument where there is a lot of complexity, where the exercise price is changing in the future because of certain events, there you cannot use Black-Scholes because you are allowed to give only one input of an exercise price. So then you move to the binomial model, right? And if it is even more complex, so in terms of the complexity, the least complex instrument you use a Black-Scholes, plain vanilla call options. Then slightly more complex, you use binomial, and the most complex you use Monte Carlo simulation, where it's so much uncertainty in there are very complex terms in the investment agreement. If there are 10 conditions defined, where let's say if I've seen conditions which are linked to one other investment, that if this guy comes as an investor, my conversion ratio will be this, So there are 10 types of conditions defined in the investment agreement.
Got it.
Those are very extremely complex instrument. There you use a Monte Carlo simulation.
Got it.
That's how the choice of a method.
So I think there are a lot of questions coming in MPV. You may want to pick up one because people are throwing in a lot of questions. So
exactly. So maybe we'll take up the questions from the members now.
Yeah.
And then probably come back to some more discussion on the complex securities. So Manish, questions are pretty interesting, but some of them are in the nature of observation, but we could clarify it for the benefit of members.
Right.
One of them says that the evaluation has become a biased process to justify.
I was about to read that. That's really an interesting one.
to justify a transaction rather than a tool to determine the real consideration of a transaction. And he's giving the example of DHFL sale at zero value to another financial instruments. So you'd like to comment on that, Manish?
No, I think it's not specific to complex securities, but I think
it's a general one. It's a general one.
My fundamental belief is that we as independent valuers come into the picture when there's a dispute, there's a non-agreement on the valuation of either company or an instrument, right? If two parties, completely unrelated parties, are sitting across the table and negotiating a value, then you don't need a independent valuer. They are the best judge of the value of that instrument or a company. We come into the picture when there's a need for somebody to look at the valuation dispassionately. So that is my limited answer.
Or there is a legal. I agree. Or there is a legal requirement.
Right. I think this question is more referring to the FEMA valuation, where I've seen a lot of valuers get appointed just to rationalize the value when it's already agreed, right? So there, I think I would suggest to the valuers is that they should not look at their role as just replicating the value. I think we are still playing an important role because we are in a way double checking the valuation. It's actually making sense. Whatever is the valuation which has been agreed by two parties, it's not just a in the air valuation. We are playing the role of an auditor there in the sense that we are saying that it's actually making sense from a multiple perspective or from a cash flow perspective. So still we are playing an important role overall there. Yeah.
And actually, expressing an opinion on a value is also part of the valuation profession, actually.
True.
And if you look at our valuation framework and valuation standards, it also recognizes the same. Right. And to the member who has raised this, I think there's a 30,000 feet observation of few exceptions which are there. But otherwise, at least my personal experience, particularly over the last 7-8 years with funds and all this, people do valuation pretty seriously to arrive at the consideration for a transaction rather than do it for a back working. But Manish, you actually so beautifully put it, and maybe at the cost of repetition for the participants, I would like to endorse that experience also, that it is the buyer and seller who actually know the real worth of the asset. And when they are independently sitting and negotiating and arriving at a number, that number is more appropriate number, because they know, the buyer knows for what purpose is going to use the asset and what is the worth of that asset. So it's he who concludes that. So those cases, the valuer steps in to tell that, yes, what you have done is right, appears to be right or not right. So I think you so nicely brought it out, Manish.
Right.
Now, the second observation which is there is, can equity shares be given to advisors in advance of services? This is again a generic question. If no ready answer, we can avoid. How to do valuation of such equity issues and accounting?
Yeah, I think there is it's as good as an ESOP. The only difference is that when the company is giving it to the employee, it is as a compensation for a service to the company.
Yeah.
The company can give it to a third party also as a compensation for his service rendered to the company. So it is still covered, I think, under IFRS 2 and AS 102. Even these kind of payment. So it is just a payment in kind. But the valuation concept and techniques still remain the same.
Don't change.
Okay. Correct. And there's enough guidance on accounting on share-based payments.
Right.
And the next question is, when the valuation for the investor rises for the asset which is carrying, will the corresponding liability to the issuer increase?
Yeah. Sorry, can you say that again, please?
Yeah. The question is, when the valuation for the investor is holding a financial asset, the value goes up. For the issuer, does the liability also correspondingly go up?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you see, you will find very interesting balance sheets of some of the companies, startup unicorns, where you can get it from MCA. Old balance sheet, you will see their equity is hugely negative, and that is because most of the instruments through which they have raised capital has been classified as derivative liability. Though it appears like a convertible preference share as an equity, but as MPV was explaining earlier, in the accounting, in the balance sheet, it has been classified as a derivative liability. And when it happens like that, it has to be valued every reporting period, right? And if the company's value is growing, the liability value also keeps increasing because it's linked to the company value. And hence it creates huge amount of losses in the balance sheet of the company because the liability amount is growing. So that's pretty much possible, and it's actually happening in a lot of these startups.
Interesting.
Yeah.
No, it's so complex, Anil, actually.
Yeah.
And I've seen some people probably in a hurry of raising money, signing this, and discovering it later. They discover it later. And it actually impacts subsequent fundraisers.
Right.
So the other observation, Manish, is Debt instruments are like debentures, bond, and is secured or unsecured. I haven't understood the question.
I think this is more of a
yeah.
kind of a statement. So debt instruments could be secured, unsecured, both, right?
Yeah,
so it doesn't matter, and
yeah,
fairly
so,
perfect. Yeah,
correct. So there's a member who is referring to the example I gave that at a subsidiary level it is equity, but when it comes to console, it becomes a debt. So his question is, should we not look at from the primary beneficiary point of view? That is the issue. The answer is yes. I'll respond it on this. So for the subsidiary entity, standalone financial statements, it is certainly equity only. Only when it comes to consolidated financial statements, what happens is, once they buy these shares, they become an intercompany transaction which will get cancelled. So for the parent company, at a console level, it is a liability. So next question, next observation, Manish, is people are requesting a little bit of clarification on. We use these words plain, vanilla, exotic, quasi-vanilla. So all these terms are used. Can you illustrate for us what each of these mean?
Like what is a plain vanilla versus an exotic versus a quasi-vanilla? Three things, if you could.
See, I mean, it's quite self-explanatory, but as I was explaining, when we use plain vanilla, we mean it is the simplest form of an instrument. Like a common share is a plain vanilla equity instrument, or a bond, which is paying coupons and every period and a principal at the end is a plain vanilla bond instrument. When you keep on adding complexity to these fundamental forms of instrument, they start becoming exotic. So it's not like that this is exotic, it's a spectrum, right? Starting with the lowest end of the spectrum, you have common share in the bond, and then you have more complex, which move into the exotic category, which becomes very structured, or there are multiple conditions attached to it, so it becomes in the exotic category. So that's how it's a very loosely used term. There's no guidance or anything anywhere mentioned about these.
So an exotic and a quasi-vanilla would be, I mean, quasi is a little less exotic, and exotic is an exotic. That's what you're trying to say.
Right.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Then I think while MPV comes up, I think there is an interesting question on where the CCDs have been guaranteed by the holding company, how the valuation of both the companies will be impacted.
CCD has been guaranteed by the holding parent. So I understand that the CCD has been issued by a subsidiary, and the parent has guaranteed the CCD, right? And the question is how the accounting will.
And how valuation of both the companies will be impacted.
Okay. So see, the guarantee means, so there can be two different types of guarantee. One is, it could be a put option, which the example which MPV gave, where the parent is giving a commitment to the investor that it will buy back the CCD at a predefined valuation, so that the investor's downside is protected. Right?
Correct.
So that is one type of guarantee. Or there is like any bank guarantee or a corporate guarantee, which the parent gives on behalf of the subsidiary. That is typically in the case of debt instrument, a corporate guarantee given. So let's say the subsidiary is a triple C rated because of some reason the balance sheet is weak of a subsidiary, but parent is very strong, right, because of its brand and things like that. So the subsidiary on its own, if it goes to the market to raise debt, it will get at a very high rate of interest, which is equivalent to a triple C rating, let's say 12% or 13%. But if the corporate gives a guarantee to the banker or the investor, the rating of the parent will get influence the rating, and the subsidiary may be able to raise that at 8% or 9%, equivalent to, let's say, AAA rating. So what we are seeing, and this is what we have also done practically, a lot of these parents or holding companies are coming to us to value corporate guarantees, because under the accounting standards, this corporate guarantee or a put option is the liability of the parent. So it should come on the balance sheet or standalone balance sheet of the parent. Right? And the subsidiary will account it like a normal whatever instrument, and the liability will come in the books of the parent. Either it's a corporate option or a corporate guarantee. both can be valued and recorded in the books of the parent. So,
Okay. So fundamentally, MPV, are we required to record it in the books, or it could become a contingent liability, or it will have to be recorded? That also depends on.
In India, we record it.
Recorded.
In AS and all, it used to be essentially a disclosure item. And as Manish was articulating, the more you understand this, and particularly when you see some of these guarantees actually getting executed, you understand that it is important to record the liability now rather than show it somewhere in notes to accounts, because it actually is a liability accumulating in your books. And what a valuer does is it tells that this is the amount which you're likely to pay. So start providing for it from now itself.
Got it. Yeah.
And so this is very common in real estate sector, because they come up with these SPVs, right, where they would pay, so they give the corporate guarantee. So we have done a lot of valuations for real estate clients for the valuation of corporate guarantee.
So there's an interesting question, Manish. We have the special purpose acquisition companies, or blank check companies as they're also called, which the member is saying that these are eye-catching nowadays. How to value these special purpose acquisition companies?
Okay. Yeah, so I guess, see, I'm not an expert on SPACs, but whatever limited I understand is these SPACs are created with a cash in hand, just with cash for the whole purpose of using that cash to acquire the target.
Yeah.
So SPAC gets listed with only cash in the balance sheet. And then they use that cash to acquire. Typically, I don't know. I mean, there's also so if you look at the SPAC value or a SPAC as a company before the acquisition, before they actually acquire a target, it is just the cash and the value of the management team which is created.
Exactly.
So maybe that gets factored in the valuation of the SPAC.
And also the area in which that particular SPAC would like to pick up investments,
Right.
So the potential area. So that's how those valuations get.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good development to happen. I hope more equity will be available. So the other question is, China has endorsed concept of super app, and one of the leading groups in India is going to endorse or explore it in India as well. For such entity who will create a super app, which will have tie-ups of equity or debt arrangements with a number of service providers, all services under one umbrella. In your view, how much complex the valuation methodology will be there for such entities, considering the underlying value of different kind of businesses which are highly dynamic?
Can you say that term again? Supra, is it?
No, super app.
Okay.
I personally, I'm not aware of this, Manish. So
sorry, NPV. I'm also not.
Okay, fine. We can leave that.
No, I didn't understand the question.
The question is like
super
this.
Super app for a lot of services under one app. That is what it's trying to say.
Yeah, that's what it says. And what it says is the service providers will all probably pick up some equity there. So they'll also pick up some equity. So how do you go about doing a valuation? So
that would be a normal business valuation, no?
Yeah. But again, it depends on what is the profit sharing methodology, what is the preferential treatment given for each of the service providers. But to be honest, I'm not aware, Anil.
I mean, just from 80,000 feet, what I'm understanding is that, for example, 3 of us get together and say that, look, we will try and put our services on a company called XYZ, right?
Yeah.
And we kind of decide to hold some shares in the company. That would become a normal valuation. If we decide on a fact that, okay, if my goods are sold more and your goods are sold less, and in the future, then you would get this percentage, and that percentage would again, I think, go back to the root of a slightly complex instrument valuation, right? But fundamentally, it continues to be equity, right? So I think, anyway, at an 80,000 feet, that I believe is
I think what you explained is right. Only thing is, probably I'm still not hands-on to understand how these are structured. I think it's best to leave it here.
There's an interesting one where it says, do you think duration of a debt security is also a risk in addition to credit risk. Also, could you throw some light on valuation of option embedded bonds?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very technical and good question. I mean, bond valuation is a completely different topic altogether. I think I was just touching upon a very broad way of valuing bond. But if you look at bond, as whoever has raised this question has rightly pointed out, there are other risks also. Credit risk is the predominant risk in the cash flows. But there's also something called a reinvestment risk, right, which is there in the bonds which are particularly paying coupons on a regular period. So, for example, if there's a bond which is paying 10% coupon every quarter or every 6 months, the risk is that you will have to reinvest that coupon if your interest rates have gone down, then you are facing that risk that you have to reinvest at a lower rate. And that risk is not there in a non-coupon paying bond. So these type of nuances are there. And duration definitely is an important aspect of a bond valuation. The discount rate is also a function of the duration. So if you look at, even when we do equity valuation, we start with a risk-free rate, right, which is derived from government bond. And the government bond also, if you look at the yield on government bond, it changes with duration. So the shortest maturity will typically have a lowest yield, and the longest maturity will have a higher yield. And that is because the investors want to be compensated for holding a long duration bond. So these concepts are there, but I think we can have a different technical session to cover this in more detail. I think this will not be enough to.
No, agreed. So I think well explained. I think you have at least taken it to a level where
right
around this. There's another interesting one. How do we apply credit spread to the coupon rate of a debt instrument?
Yeah, so see, as I explained earlier, the methodology for a loan or a bond valuation, the credit spread is not applied to the coupon rate; it is applied to the risk-free rate, which is derived from, again, the government bonds, because government bonds are considered as risk-free, right? So if I'm valuing a loan or a bond which is issued by a AAA rated company, right? So that interest could be 9%. Let's say I'm just taking a number, 8% or 9%. Now, if I am valuing that bond, I will start with the risk-free rate, which could be 5% or 6% for the same maturity. Let's say the bond is for a 5-year maturity. So I will look at a government bond, which is also for a 5-year maturity. And let's say the yield on that government bond is 5%. And then I will go back to the from the other sources where I can quantify the spread of a AAA rated bond, or look at other listed bonds of AAA companies and quantify that spread. And that spread could be 2% or 1.5%, and that will give me the discount rate. The coupon is already decided. It is in case it is a fixed rate bond, and that fixed coupon plus the principal, I'll discount using this spread.
I think we'll have to keep a session on this, MPV. This complexity does not justify the format of the session today, but I think it's given a fantastic direction in terms of the complexities involved. If you may permit me, MPV, there is another interesting one which says CCPS, if convertible and classified as equity as of today, do we have to compute NCI on that?
He's talking about non-controlling interest on that.
See, that again is a very interesting and complex accounting topic. You know, it's definitely a valuation topic, but you should read Ind AS 109 on how you deal with, and this is a very common scenario we face in doing a purchase price allocation. So I don't know if most of you would be.
I think we should ask MPV to answer all these complex questions there.
So see, this again depends, it depends on the CCPS. If it's a put option embedded in like if the company who is acquiring the remaining majority stake is giving a put option to the sellers on the remaining NCI, then that NCI becomes like a liability in the books. It's not an equity. It is treated as a liability because there's a put option given by the buyer to buy the remaining stake. So it becomes like liability. If it is like a pure equity instrument held by somebody else, then it gets recorded as a non-controlling interest.
Right. Interesting. Back to you, MPV. Yeah.
So, Manish, just one clarification which members are seeking. Is the FIMDA data available free of cost? Is it accessible freely by all?
I think so. I mean, last I checked, it was free, but I'm not sure. I mean, you can just go to the website and see.
Yeah. And here is an example which a member has given. Compulsorily convertible debenture with a coupon rate of 15%. And convertible option with investor within 30 years at fair market value, but not less than face value. Will it be considered as equity or debt or compound financial instrument in the books of issuer?
See,
You want me to repeat, Manish? You want me to repeat? So
no, I got a sense of the terms. So the key here is that it is mentioned that it is convertible at the fair value.
Correct.
Right? That is the crux of this instrument. Correct. Now, whenever that happens, essentially what it means is that if, let's say, I've invested 10 crores today, and my fair, or let's say I take one CCPS value, which is 100 rupees, and my fair value of the common share is also 100 today. So it is convertible into one common share if I convert it fair value, right? But after 2 years, if my common share value becomes 50 instead of 100, I will get 2 shares, right? And if it becomes 200, I will get half a share, because it says that it will convert at fair value. So the conversion ratio here is variable, which means that it will change depending on the fair value of the underlying common share. And when that happens, it is a pure liability instrument, because as I think MPV explained very nicely, it is you are essentially just taking a liability. Instead of paying cash, you are paying in kind through your common shares. So essentially, it's just like a liability, this type of CC.
Then there's other question, Manish. You actually explained it earlier, and Anil also made that request for that explanation. But since few members are asking, many of them are asking, maybe at the cost of repetition, you can explain. The question is, what factors should be considered while deciding the model, whether it's Black-Scholes or Monte Carlo or the binomial model? So in what situation A, B, C? I think a little more clarity on that.
Right. So see, it is very simple. If you can use Black-Scholes, you use Black-Scholes, but the usability becomes very restricted, because in Black-Scholes, you have to give 6 inputs. And if you are able to come up with those inputs, it's the easiest thing to do. You have to just go to an online tool or even an Excel sheet, you put that formula and get those inputs, you'll get a number, which is the value of the option. But the usability becomes restricted because, as I was explaining earlier, some of the input, particularly exercise price, is not fixed in some instruments. It changes in different scenarios in future. So when you have those scenarios, the usability, you cannot even use a Black-Scholes model. It's not even a choice with you. So you have to use a binomial model, which gives you that flexibility. So binomial model, what it does, it starts with the current value and it creates a tree. So let's say it will create 20 different scenarios at the end of 3 years or 5 years of possible stock prices or the company value. And then you have the flexibility to calculate the payoff of that instrument in each of those 20 scenarios, and then you roll it back to present value. So then you take binomial as the next option. And sometimes even a binomial model gives you, you cannot, like, if you are dealing with a situation where the conversion or let's say exercise price is linked to the IPO or a non-IPO scenario, you cannot model that in a binomial model. So you will use a Monte Carlo simulation in that context. So that is how the choice of different methodology depends on, Yeah.
So nice, and Manish, thanks a lot. So there's another question on valuation of a compulsorily convertible debenture of a private company. What can be the methods for that?
Yeah, so compulsory convertible debenture, as I mentioned, you have to go deep into the terms of the CCPS and look at how the conversion is happening. Just the form or the term of the instrument will not decide the method. Just because it is a compulsory convertible debenture will not decide the method. You have to see how the conversion is happening. If it is fixed, for example, if you have invested 100 is the par value of CCPS and it always converts into one common share, it is fixed, then you don't have to do anything. You have to just value it like a common share because it is as good as one common share. You just value the company and divide it by the number of shares on a converted basis and multiply it by the conversion ratio, which is 1. So you'll get the CCPS value. But if the conversion ratio is variable, which is linked to, let's say, valuation multiple, or it is like there are 2-3 ratios, even if it is fixed, but the fixed also changes depending on whether it's an IPO. If it is an IPO, it is 1:2. If it is acquisition, it is 1:3. Then you have to do a scenario-based valuation, which I explained earlier. So the choice of method will depend on the terms of the CCPS.
No, interesting. So I think that kind of brings us. This is another interesting one for valuation of complex securities. How do we apply discounts for marketability or control, etc.? If any, are there any commonly accepted benchmarks here? While you explained how you do that, but is there a variability that you need to look at marketability or control, for example, here?
Yeah, so it is definitely considered, but that's not specific to complex securities or convertible. It is common. It is applicable to any, even if you're valuing a common share. But if you, even the new standards which ICI has also issued and IBSC has also issued, it says that when you're valuing a company also or a common share, you have to first define the basis of valuation or the the premise, things like that. So if my basis of valuation is a non-controlling, non-marketable basis, which is the basis I adopt when I'm valuing a ESOP, right? So the difference is that when I'm valuing a ESOP, I'm looking at it from the perspective of an employee holding, let's say, 1% of the company, which is a minority basis. So, or even if I'm valuing a CCPS, where it is on a minority basis, then a discount for lack of control or a lack of marketability should be factored. I mean, it's again a very topic in itself on how you quantify and what scenarios lead to that discount or a premium. But that's a general answer to that question. Yeah.
So Manish, there is one question actually in the first lot of questions which came, which I held back at that time. So when it comes to income tax and FEMA purposes,
right?
So these complex securities, how are they valued, and what is your experience of those authorities' perception or approach towards these securities and the valuations?
Yeah, I think that's a very good practical question because we can discuss all the theoretical aspects, but if we are not able to apply. So I think the application of these complex methodologies that we are discussing is very limited when it comes to FEMA or tax valuations. I've seen, from a practical experience, we have used very complex methods when it comes to accounting valuations because the auditors are quite sophisticated nowadays and they understand these nuances. But when it comes to regulatory valuations for tax and FEMA purposes, the common practice I've seen is that most of the valuers do it on a fully diluted basis, which means that even if the conversion terms are quite contingent or unless it's like a fair value when it becomes like a liability only, the example which I discussed, but if it's like contingent where the conversion ratio will change in future, they don't incorporate those valuations. They will just select a particular ratio based on the current valuation. Whatever is the ratio applicable, conversion ratio based on the current valuation, and they will assume that the CCPS is converted to so many equity shares, and they will calculate the value on a converted basis. They'll not get into the scenarios of how the conversion ratio will change in future and what is the downside protections. All those gets ignored when it comes to tax and FEMA valuation. And that is, I think, that is going to change in future, because if I compare to US market, the IRS, when you do valuations, and we have done some of those from India for the US tax authorities, which is the IRS, they are very sophisticated, and I've seen very complex methodologies being used, factoring the liquidation preference. This is a 409A valuation we call, whenever in US, a US company issues shares to the employees, they are required to issue it at fair value. And when they issue, they value these shares issued to employee, they use very complex techniques, auction pricing methods or Monte Carlo simulation to come up with the fair value for the tax authority. So I think in India, to answer the question, it is still very nascent. The tax authorities are not so sophisticated and FEMA, but it is going to move to that level where US is today. That's my feeling.
Yeah. No, Manish, I just make a small difference there. I think it's about the number of such transactions happening. So if you look at US, the market is such that it's so very common to come across those many transactions. In India, I think we are just getting there. We are now just getting there. At least if I see the last 5 years balance sheets, right from very small companies to large companies, we are seeing these kind of instruments coming up. So I think the income tax department will soon come. And Anil would also recall that recently the ministry was looking at a paper where they can have a convergence across the valuation approaches for all of these purposes. So I think we are getting there. It's a question of maturity of the requirement rather than the individuals involved.
Absolutely.
So that's
I would like to correct that. It's nothing on the tax. It's just the way the market is. India market is
exactly.
And I've seen a huge improvement in the reviews also.
Just that the revenue. Just that the revenue is not finding too much meat there at this point in time. The day they start finding meat, don't worry, I think they'll come all over you. And I think we'll have a good time because, our expertise would be called in more and more in terms of valuation. So, Manish, you're going to be super busy for the next 10 years there.
For all of us, that's the hope for everybody, I think, on this section.
So, MBB, I think there is an interesting question for you.
Okay.
This is coming from your example. So your example is continue. So if we book the liability in the parent books for the guarantee given on behalf of the loan taken by the subsidiary, then the liability will be there in both books. Subsidiary will have to bank loan liability, and in parents, the subsidiary will have to book loan liability, and in the parent's book, guarantee as a liability in balance sheet. Kindly explain whether it is correct to have two liability for the same loan.
No, it's a little different, Anil. So what happens is, let's assume you have guaranteed a loan which you have given me. So, which Manish has given me. I will show the loan as 100 only. So what will happen is, suppose my credentials are very strong. Let's assume I'm financially pretty sound. So the probability of your guarantee getting invoked is 0. So in your books, liability will appear as 0. But as my credit worthiness keeps deteriorating, there's a probability that maybe 20% of my liability you may have to honor, 30% you may have to honor. So that's how the liability gets accumulated in your books. So otherwise it doesn't come. And
so what I'm saying at a reasonable time, still the impact of 100 crore liability, the total impact in both the balance sheets could be 100 plus, could be 125, for example.
No. It could be
maybe 25% comes on my book, but you are not allowing a subsidiary to deduct that 25% of the value of the liability in the owner's balance sheet, right? In the holding company's balance.
But in the consolidated balance sheet, they'll get knocked off. That's
why
the entire standards are focused on consolidated statements.
Consolidation mode.
Individual ones, actually.
Fantastic. I know you would have an answer for that, MPV. Don't worry.
Right. Not that way. But there are some small technical issues there. And many times our accounting understanding is based on how these are seen for tax. That's another problem we have.
Yeah, that's
good. I think we are now past 12:30, Anil. So
correct.
Would you like to conclude there? good number
No,
of
I think
questions which
there are
have come.
some. So thank you, MPV. I think yes, we are at 12:30. Today is a happy day for a lot of our viewers. I think Manish has taken this subject, which is absolutely complex, in as simple manner as possible. So thank you so much, Manish, for doing this. I think there are still more questions, and we keep getting them. And interestingly, MPV, I think all our members are asking complex questions also to this complex topic. So, which is also very interesting for all of us. And I'm sure in the booklet, which is likely to come back, they would have answers for a couple of them that we have not had an opportunity to answer today. But I think looking at this session today, MPV, I think there is merit in having a 1.5 hour or 2 hour session, which is a slightly more detailed one, and maybe with some presentation format around it. So I would of course encourage Sarika, maybe we could keep a session on complex instrument valuation with Manish, or even some index expert also in that session, so that we kind of add value to our members here, because I think this is fairly complex not to end today. But I think thank you, Manish, for an absolutely fantastic directional discussion that we have had, with as much as detailed explanations that you could have done during this point in time. Sarika, to you to do the honors, formal honors. But I think I've had a very pleasurable discussion today, and today seemed to be a heavy discussion, MPV, for all of us here.
I agree.
So
Yes, sir.
it's a pleasure to be part of this session, Anil and MPV. And happy to take any complex question offline. You can collate the questions.
So Sarika would collate all of this.
Yeah.
We come out with a booklet, Manish, every week. There is a booklet coming in. So she would trouble you and take some answers from you.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, on to you, Sarika.
Thank you so much, sir. As the topic suggests, it is really complex. So members are also requesting to have a session with the presentation, simultaneous Excel sheet, so that they can understand nuances of this session. And we have certain difficulties, and there are a lot of complex securities. So on each security or combined together, we can have a session with Excel sheet as well as presentation in future. Maybe we cannot have it on Sunday, but on any other day. So we can have it on any other day. So thank you, Mr. Manish, for accepting this invitation.
Sarika,
Yes,
what you should do is, I think with chairman's permission, maybe you should do a workshop of 2 or 3 workshops only focused on modeling, where we focus only on spreadsheets starting from input cell to output cell. I think we should look at 3-4.
That we will do, sir. So practical sessions also we will have on any of the weekdays. Evening sessions we'll try to have it. All the 10 booklets of 10 sessions in June, May, June and July have already been published on our VSB page. Members can download it and refer. For the sessions that are being conducted in August will be uploaded in September 1st week. And next week we do not have a session. Please enjoy your Raksha Bandhan festival. This week it was decided by Chairman sir that let us not.
So I was telling Sarika that come rain or snow, of course it doesn't snow here for us in Mumbai at least, but we should have this Sundays. But it being a Raksha Bandhan, I thought it might not be appropriate. So let's all celebrate Raksha Bandhan for the next week. So we are going to miss our session next week, Sarika, but doesn't matter. Maybe we'll use this time to set up 1 or 2 series that we want to set up for complex instruments and some other things that we did. So, but fantastic so far,
So thank you, Anil Bhandari sir. Thank you, MPV sir. Thank you, Sehgal sir in absentia. Thank you, Mr. Manish Saxena. Look forward for future deliberations also. Thank you all the participants for being with us and continuously watching this Sunday series 13th week. We have come on 13th week continuously, and same kind of participation, active participation we have. So thank you so much.
No, I happened to be in one of the branches yesterday, Sarika, and I think people have come across and told me that this Sunday with valuation experts is a fantastic thing which is happening, and people who are really interested continue to keep glued on. So I think thank you for sticking to our schedule, and we continue to do this well.
In fact,
Thank
Anil,
you
I
on a
just
Sunday.
Anil, I just saw the next lot of questions. All the 10 questions are extraordinarily good, actually. Unfortunately, they have just come in. Maybe we'll answer it in the ATQ, but Manish, they are very good questions, Manish. All the 10 questions are very good.
Look forward to those questions.
Sure. Yeah. We'll share that.
Yeah, we will share with you tomorrow. So thank you so much. Bye-bye. See you next week.
Bye.
29.
Absolutely. Bye. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Manish, once again.
Thank
Bye.
you.